So the kind of part of what I'm hearing from that is that those levels in soil, like them or not, whether they're working correctly or not, whether they're updated quickly enough or not, there are a lot of issues with that. But it does get you that trigger
I think that's important.
to evaluate it and the notification associated with that.
And I think LSPs do know the, 1 feet, within 500, in the top foot within 500 feet. I think LSPs are well aware of that, and they think about it when they get their data set.
And you don't need a risk assessor.
Right, you don't need a risk
To
assessor.
tell you that. And that's
Simple, yeah.
And that's what, kind of one of the things, and I have a number of threads going through my mind at the moment, are that is interesting in this discussion is absent a risk assessor who can look at some of these conditions and immediately kind of ballpark it as that's something that should trigger an imminent hazard evaluation. That's something you should look at. What a non-risk assessor LSP would look at kind of early on in the process, before you're actually looking at the risk, what triggers in your mind, if it's not a metal on that short list in 0321, and so what triggers are in your mind the need to evaluate whether it's an imminent hazard or not? Are there
I mean, TCE in a commercial space, you're still.
TCE in indoor air? Okay, we
Yeah,
cut that.
but there are real numbers to that, Lisa, so that's.
Yeah,
fine.
and even then,
Right.
there are numbers.
Right.
So is it, what I'm hearing is if we want people to reevaluate whether it's imminent hazard, the issue on the table was how do we get them to look at, how do we get all of us look at substantial hazards if we introduce this new substantial hazard evaluation. I would extend that to imminent hazards as well. What are the triggers for that? One is having something at 0321 that says, under these conditions, you should at least be thinking of it and do an evaluation. And then an alternative is, so that's at any time that you come across these set of conditions and how to describe them, having numbers is the simplest way, is one way of doing it.
Or a list.
Or a list.
Of compounds.
And then the second thing is to have a point in time in the process, like phase one, or after 1 year where you say, okay, do an imminent and substantial hazard evaluation, or check off that you have done one and it poses no imminent or substantial hazard or something like that. But kind of move something like that ahead in the process so that there's a point in time where you have to make a representation to the department of some kind.
Could you add a box to the notification form about doing it, so that to capture so you don't have an imminent hazard, you didn't trigger, SRM or CEP.
You don't want to do it every year.
Yeah, did you do it at 120, at 120 days, have a box?
I'm wondering if, in the phase of the investigation, phase one seems really not going to have as much data as you will eventually. Just thinking out loud, is there something missing if you set it too early? People do it, oh great, I don't have anything, and then you collect more data, and you're not looking at it again.
Well, no, you still have an obligation,
and then
if
you
we put it on the tier classification, you still, even after the phase one, would have an obligation to reevaluate it. Just like you have an ongoing evaluation to, if conditions change or you get more data, you're always supposed to be double checking that you don't have an imminent hazard. I mean, that is part of the paradigm.
I guess, if you're relying on that form, that quantitative, that milestone, phase one, you need to do substantial hazard, you do it,
Yeah.
you're getting more data, but maybe people will not think about it because, oh, I just did it, and I don't know, just
Well,
thought.
then that's their problem.
And if the
Right.
RNF,
Whereas your screening value might make people.
Well, then they're not doing their job.
if the RNF had
There
a
should be.
series of questions on it, is there a school nearby? Is it in this surface where, this is coming into DEP and there's a sort of a data check?
Yeah, but then you're putting them responsibility
No,
on
but they
DEP.
call anyway, so.
What?
But it might be a second level
Yeah.
of, that maybe we need to do something fast.
Well,
So what's the harm in putting a box on the 120-day notification? Is there an imminent hazard? Is there a substantial hazard?
That's what I'm saying.
Well, there would still be a reg to underlie anything that went on the form, so.
Well, yeah.
Right, because we have one
Well, the things to think about there. One is that if we had that box, then certainly if it was an imminent hazard, that's what they argued. They should be making a two-hour notification anyway.
Yeah.
So they shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, so don't.
So a yes answer on that block, we should never see a yes answer on that block.
On the imminent hazard.
Because it should, this trigger.
Right.
So that's one thing. The second thing, and maybe more problematic, is at what point do you need an LSP? And who's involved and who's filling out the forms? And for notification, LSP is not required.
Right.
So the quality of that assessment and checking off that box for 120-day notification is kind of, well, yeah. No, I don't see any imminent hazard. It wouldn't necessarily meet the same standards of evaluation. That's something later on.
Well, what about when someone's doing a due diligence and they find an imminent hazard, or someone just bought a property and they're thinking of doing, a renovation? Technically, you don't need an LSP in that situation either, so I
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily,
I don't think
it
it's
wouldn't
a deal
necessarily
breaker.
hurt, but I think we wouldn't rely solely upon that. Because you don't know, you don't necessarily know
Who's looking at this.
who's doing it and who's making that representation. There's no-
Why isn't an LSP required for notification? Because there should have been at least an environmental professional involved in the development of that data. So they're in the process somewhere. So it would add
They're
some
in the
validity.
assessment process, but they're not in the MCP process until
How
the
many
notification.
people have been in or seen a situation where there was literally no LSP involved at the point someone was notified?
Well, absolutely, you see people do phase one, ASTM phase
No,
one.
I agree. At the point of notification though, how many people don't have
You
LSPs?
see people do ASTM phase ones.
But they still have to be a qualified environmental
Right,
professional just
but
to sign the phase one. So
That does not mean they're an LSP, they can be
Right.
from out of state. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
You know,
becoming, can I follow up on something Joe was saying before? I think this may be a helpful way to think about what things we wanna make sure stay in an imminent hazard, like where you find out in 2 hours or 72 hours or whatever it is, like really soon, versus things that you find out still soon, but not in a hot minute. And so trying to think about those two groups as sort of the imminent hazard, the things you find about really quickly, as being very high potential risks and places where we want people to make decisions based on limited and perhaps inadequate data sets, where you want people to they have one data point, it may not be fully characteristic, but you want them to assume there's a problem and tell you about it, and then go and get the rest of the data later, if that makes sense. So where we want, if you have one exceedance, we want to hear about it now. Versus other things like a good example would be exposure to lead in soil. It's not something somebody's breathing and can't stop doing, and it's not something there's sort of a difference between air and soil, right? Soil is patchy, one exceedance doesn't necessarily mean the whole thing is coming to an end. So there are places where you should appropriately want to hear about things based on small data sets because they could be an indicator of the problem. And there are other places where it may be more appropriate to take a minute and get not a full data set, not necessarily a whole phase 2 data set, but enough data to evaluate a risk and not be reporting based on single exceedances. And I think if that structure makes sense, then we can sort of group what risks are those higher priority ones, what exposures are those higher priority ones, and what are not, and regardless of what you call them, but if we stick with the same language, then the ones where you want people to sort of assume the worst and notify and then continue to investigate, those are the imminent hazards. And then the ones where they could still be relatively short-term risks, but it makes sense to take a minute and get some data, those are substantial hazards. And then the imminent hazard ones are largely, that's where you were talking at the beginning, Lisa, you get a lot of those with the CEP. And then I think it becomes just a few additional things that have to do with commercial and really commercial exposure.
It's gonna probably be indoor air if it's.
It's largely gonna be indoor air and drinking water, and it's gonna be non-cancer risks are the things that go in that we need to hear about it soon. like things that could happen, and then the cancer risks, and then we can talk about like when it makes sense, and if it makes sense to have it be sooner than a year or whatever, but that's a place where it doesn't, those other ones, the cancer risks, they can be based on more than just one data point and a risk assessment. I think that's as I'm like trying to think it through, I think it's helpful to put the risks into those groups, and then we can structure the notification around when you want to hear about those different things.
And I like thinking about it that way, I agree with that. I guess the thing I struggle with from a risk perspective, and this is largely going to your comment, Steve, is, those cancer numbers are based on lifetime of exposure, the toxicity values we use. And in fact, a lot of non-cancer effects are based on chronic toxicity values versus subchronic. And so when we're doing these calculations, and right now in the realm we're in, and we're telling people they have imminent hazards, a lot of times we're using risk information that's not even representative of those kind of exposures. And so that's what I struggle with from a risk perspective, that we're calling these things imminent hazards. To me, imminent means, like you're saying, right now, we gotta get on this and
Okay,
act.
but the flip side of that,
Okay.
and let's take the chronic versus subchronic toxicity values, for instance. When we tend to use the chronic toxicity values to evaluate subchronic exposures when we don't have subchronic toxicity values.
I get that.
Yeah, well, no, I know, I'm stating the obvious
Okay.
for at least some people in the room. But for everybody else, and for everybody who will be watching on YouTube later, sit up straight. You're watching your posture. For everybody else, on the one hand, you look at that and say, well, it's being conservative because we're using the chronic toxicity value to evaluate the non-chronic. But it also introduces a lot of uncertainty, that we don't know what the subchronic effects are. We don't know if we should be more concerned at those levels. TCE being an example, where the difference between the chronic and the acute is not going to be that huge.
Right.
So it's not necessarily as conservative as you might initially think. And I think that's one of the things, going back to the cancer risk. As I said, one of the reasons that we lumped it in 5 years is because we didn't know how to accurately or appropriately assess shorter-term exposures to carcinogens. That is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about them, or that they might not have effects, and arguably, it may not be linear, like we assume for the lifetime exposure, but in that short term, if it's not linear, what is it? And should we be more concerned or less concerned about it? We don't necessarily know what would be appropriate, and that introduces uncertainty, and that uncertainty should count for something in evaluating how quickly we
Right, I'm not advocating that we don't address those. I agree with you, and I think there is uncertainty. I think, like you started this whole conversation with, a lot of this is the perception of people who don't understand how we're calculating things and what we're calling things. And in general, I would say that most states and even EPA wouldn't call something that is a 4-year cancer risk an imminent hazard. It's just not appropriate terminology. And so I think we do need to capture those situations, but I think I like the idea of grouping it in a different category, and also for carcinogen, you especially don't want to rely on one data point.
Right.
I mean, that's just,
Or for
it's not appropriate.
petroleum, you hear people, part of it, I think the problem with imminent hazard is, you get people sort of operating at the same level of concern about, TCE and indoor air at 10 micrograms per cubic meter, and naphthalene in indoor air. That the level of concern is not is not
You have to
appropriate.
be careful between what you're saying is an imminent hazard and
No,
You're
but,
using those,
but,
you're
no, I'm
actually-
not, but you could have now to lean at an imminent hazard level, and then
That's
people
not
respond to them. Right, but you could, and then people respond to them as if they're the same thing, and they're not, and it's like, it's appropriate for the reg to help. And I mean, if you're not a risk assessor and you read the reg, it's not inappropriate to interpret it that way. And so to have the reg align with what the department is actually concerned about, I think makes sense and communicates to the public what you're actually concerned about. Like right now, it communicates that you're concerned about things that you may not actually be as, that in really short time
It
periods.
seems like a
that are-
crisis,
Right,
you know.
So,
Just because we're finding out about it now doesn't necessarily mean it is a crisis.
yeah. I like the idea of requiring a substantial hazard evaluation at phase one. That also, and then that could then trigger an immediate